Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Prime Minister, why don't we start with some actual facts? What is the net number of EU migrants that have arrived in this country since you became Prime Minister 6 years ago?
I think the net number is about 600,000 people have left this country to go and work or live in other European Union countries, and about 1.2 million have come to live or to work here. So big numbers moving in each direction. But of course, immigration is a challenge, and it's a particular challenge when our economy has been growing strongly, we've been creating jobs, and people have come to our country to work. But I think the way to meet that challenge mustn't be to leave the single market, harm our economy, hurt jobs, and damage our country. So we've got to find the right ways of dealing with the movement of people, not the wrong ways. So
the number net is 667,000. That's 121,000 per year. Now, you know this document, your manifesto, and in it, you promised to reduce annual net migration to the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands. It literally has been hundreds of thousands. How is this promise compatible with staying in the European Union?
Well, when I made that ambition for Britain, that we should be seeing net migration come down to under 100,000, at that time, the net migration between people leaving the UK to go and live and work in Europe and people coming from Europe to live and work here was broadly in balance. And so it was about trying to reduce migration from outside the United Kingdom, something where more than half our migration comes from, and something we are able to do. But we've obviously been living in quite extraordinary times when the British economy has been growing very strongly. We've created 2 million jobs in our country. There was a time in the last Parliament when we were creating more jobs than the rest of Europe put together. Now, I don't think that will continue forever. The European economies are starting to recover. You see that in France and Germany. Ireland grew by 7% last year. So you're beginning to see that recovery. But I say again, as we tackle this challenge, the worst thing we could do is pull out of the single market, as those who want us to leave suggest, and damage our economy. And I think it is worth stopping for a second to understand why coming out of the single market is so damaging. Because I think that's
I just want to focus on migration. Migration is very important in this. And I put it to you again, that you just cannot control... I mean, it's oxymoronic. Some might say lose the oxy to control freedom of movement. You can't control freedom of movement. So why did you make that pledge?
Because, as I say, there have been many years where movements, people out of Britain into Europe, out of Europe into Britain, have been broadly in balance. And of course, we have in the single market.
You knew this a year ago when you restated this promise.
I think it is, and I think it remains.
The crisis was there, and you made the promise again, and it's a promise that cannot be fulfilled whilst we remain in the European Union.
Well, I don't accept that. I think it remains the right ambition for Britain.
Look, how can it be? You seriously think it can be fulfilled whilst we stay in the European Union? How can it be fulfilled?
Because there have been years, and there will be again, where people from Britain choose to go and work overseas in other European countries.
Any single year of your premiership?
Well, it happened when I first set out the ambition.
Can you seriously see it happening at any period whilst you're still Prime Minister in the next 4 years?
I'm not going to put a date on it, but I'll say, Faisal, there are good ways of controlling migration and there are bad ways. A good way is doing what I did in my renegotiation, which of course hasn't come into effect yet and will if we vote to stay in the European Union, which is to say to people, if you come to our country, first of all, you don't claim unemployment benefit. Second of all, after 6 months, if you haven't got a job, you have to leave. And third of all, if you do come and get a job, you have to work for 4 years, paying into the system, before you get full access to our welfare system.
Full access, you know what I'm going to say?
Yes, absolutely.
That wasn't the manifesto commitment. Yeah. You said no access for 4 years.
Yeah, no, well, we got not full access for 4 years, which is, I think, very important, because, of course, today someone can come from a European country and get an extra £10,000 on top of their wages. So that is a good way to control immigration.
How many?
That will
Out of EU migrants, what proportion of EU migrants have claimed tax credits?
It's over 40% are claiming tax credits.
That number's pretty sketchy. The DWP have said no to that
number. That is the number.
1 in 8. 1 in 8
The number I have is that 40%, and for some of them they get as much as £10,000. Now, look, let's be clear. I think we should welcome the fact that people want to come to our country, work hard, make a contribution, pay into our system, but they ought to pay in before they get out. And that's what I've secured through my negotiation. No more something for nothing. And I think that is very powerful and very important.
But your deal, if you were serious, again, about meeting this target, you'd have tried in some way to negotiate or renegotiate freedom of movement. You thought about that for a couple of days, but Angela Merkel said no.
No, what happened was there's a whole series of changes to freedom of movement, because it isn't freedom of movement if you're a criminal, it isn't freedom of movement if you're a terrorist, it isn't freedom of movement if you've conducted a sham marriage. And as I say, it isn't freedom of movement if you cannot support yourself. If you come to Britain, you can't find a job, you can't support yourself, we can make you go home. And I think that's very important. But look, I'll be absolutely level with you and the audience and everyone back at home. We're in the single market. It's a market of 500 million people. It is vital to the success of our businesses. Part of that single market is British people being able to work and live in other European countries, and Europeans being able to come and live and work in our country. But as I say, work. Not if they can't sustain themselves, they have to go home. Now, if you want to get out of the single market, which is what the Leave campaign want to do, you will fundamentally damage our economy. That cannot be the right way of controlling immigration. It would make our economy smaller, it would cost jobs, we'd be poorer as a country. And that would have a real effect on people watching this show. Fewer jobs. We'd see prices go up because the pound would go down. The cost of the weekly shop would go up.
Why did you not say that in your manifesto a year ago when you knew you were having this referendum and you made the same claim and we already had the Eurozone crisis? You understand there's an important matter of trust and credibility, and this promise was never achievable.
No, I don't accept that. What I'm saying is, I said very clearly in the manifesto, Britain benefits from being in a reformed European Union, and we're going to conduct that reform, which we've done, then we're going to hold that referendum, and yes, we do need to do things to control immigration, like restricting in-work welfare, but it would be madness to try to do that by trashing our economy and pulling out of the single market. And I think this is, let's just take an example so people can understand what I mean. If you take our car industry, hugely successful, 150,000 people employed in it. We can sell our cars all over Europe with no taxes, no tariff, and no trouble. If we were outside the single market and we had a deal like, say, America does, which is what the head of the Leave campaign has recommended, that would be a 10% tax on our cars. Now, I think of the car workers at Nissan on that production line, their jobs, their salaries, their livelihoods. If we were to get out of the single market, we'd see fewer jobs in the car industry, we'd see less investment in our country. That would be a self-inflicted wound for Britain.
I know you want to talk about the single market. On immigration, though, it strikes me that you failed to hit your target. You failed to get a deal that would allow you to reach that target. And you've also failed, really, on sovereignty. You talk about the single market. You said, you know, in terms of control over laws, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, a necessary part of the single market, is supreme in UK law. Do you accept that?
Well, I accept that we have a single market and you have to have a single set of rules for that market. So someone making fan belts in Bolton can sell them to all 28 countries of the European Union rather than having to meet 27 rules. But what I achieved in my negotiation for the first time ever was targets for cutting regulation, targets for cutting bureaucracy. Let's make this a single market with necessary regulation, not unnecessary regulation. But again, the point is this: would we be more sovereign if we left? Would we have more control? Just picture the scene. We're out of the single market, out of the European Union. You're a car manufacturer. You want to sell your cars into Europe. You've still got to meet all the specifications, all the rules of the single market. The only difference is you're no longer round the table writing the rules.
We'd still
so how does that make us...
We'd still have a car industry.
But it doesn't make... The crucial thing, Faisal, it doesn't make you more sovereign. Because suddenly what you've done is you've given up the ability to help make the rules that govern the market, which takes almost half of the goods and services that we sell. Well, that isn't more power, that's less power.
Let's take an example. Last year, in your manifesto, again, you promised a VAT lock. In your Queen's speech, you got Her Majesty to say that there will be to ensure that there are no rises in VAT rates for the next 5 years. But 8 days later, this court in Luxembourg, the European Court of Justice, told you that it was not allowed, that you had to raise the VAT on solar panels and on wind turbines. How can you accept that interference with VAT rules?
Well, the main rate of VAT is within our control. We've said in our manifesto we're not going to increase it, and we're not going to increase it. The European Court...
VAT is going up on solar panels. Well, that's what the European Court said.
What we said in our manifesto is about the main rate of VAT and the lower rates of VAT. We are not changing them. The European Court, from time to time, does make judgments about individual projects because there's a single set of rules in Europe governing some of these things. But our promise on VAT absolutely stands good, as does our promise on income tax. We said we wouldn't increase the rates, and we haven't, as does our pledge on other taxes.
This was a Cypriot, a Portuguese, a Spanish and a Bulgarian judge overruling the sense of one of your promises in a Queen's speech to decide a British VAT rate.
I don't accept that. In our manifesto, we talked about the principal rates of VAT, and we haven't moved those. But if you're saying, Faisal, you have a court in Europe that sets rules for a single market, yes, you do. And if you didn't have a set of rules, you wouldn't have a single market. And if we didn't have a single market, it's 500 million people. It's the biggest market in the world. It's something Britain worked incredibly hard to create. And it makes us, effectively, part of the biggest economy in the world. So when we go and negotiate a trade deal with China, we're bigger than them. But we can get a better deal.
That's the deal you've done. You get access to the market, but this court is supreme over UK law.
There's a set of rules for the single market.
Well, it's not just the single market. They've been opining on headscarves. They've been opining on deportation of foreign criminals.
If you're saying...
They've been talking about child benefits.
If you're saying, are there frustrations with the European Union? Is it imperfect? Do I find it frustrating as someone who's sceptical about these grand schemes of visions? Yes, of course there are frustrations. That's what my negotiation was designed to address.
And you didn't succeed.
And we did address... No, we addressed lots of those things.
Not all of it.
We did. We got Britain...
Portuguese and Bulgarian judge speaking in French. French is a beautiful language, but what is the accountability for a voter, for someone in the audience, to tell the European Court of Justice, I don't want you talking about headscarves in Britain or the VAT rate on solar panels?
No, we got targets...
How do I fire this person?
Well, you fire them through the Council of Ministers, which is the responsible body on which I sit. So, look, Faisal, this is very important because, you know, if you're saying there are frustrations, of course there are.
I'm not saying frustrations. I'm saying we are not sovereign in this regard. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but we're not having a referendum on, you know, do we approve of every decision of the European Court? We're having a referendum on should we stay in this organisation, which is good for our economy, that strengthens Britain's role in the world, or should we leave? I'm not sitting here for 1 minute saying this organisation is perfect. If I'd thought that, I wouldn't have done a renegotiation that got us out of ever closer union, that set targets for burden reduction, that safeguarded the pound, that said we'd never have to bail out Eurozone countries, that stopped discrimination against our currency and said that we could make sure people had to work here before they got full access to our welfare system. Those were all dealing with frustrations that we have about the European Union.
So you mentioned the Council of Ministers. Which nation has been most overruled in the Council of Ministers since you became Prime Minister?
This is a totally phony statistic, which you're about to deliver, because I've read about this one.
12%.
And the truth, I tell you why it's a phony. Let me tell you exactly why it is a phony statistic. We insist that where we disagree with a judgment, and we're on the winning side, I think, on 80% of occasions. Where we disagree...
Well, so that's 20% when you're not. So
where we... Hang on. Where we disagree...
You said it was phony. It's not
I'll
phony.
answer your question. So, where we disagree, lots of other countries, when they disagree, they'll say, OK, we actually often insist on voting against a register that we don't approve of a particular regulation. But look, if you're saying to me, are there regulations in Europe that annoy you? Yes. Are there things about Europe that frustrate you? Yes. Look, I'm the Prime Minister who sits around the table with 27 other heads of government and state, and sometimes this organisation drives me crazy. But do I sit there and think Britain would be better off if we left? You know, are we quitters? Do we think we quit the European Union, we quit the single market, and that somehow we would be better off? Absolutely not. I'll tell you what it would be like. We would be outside the room. The European Union doesn't stop existing just because we've left. The channel doesn't get any wider if we decide to leave. A group of people would be sitting around a table making decisions about our biggest market, about the future of our continent, about things that affect us, and we would have our nose sort of pressed to the window trying to find out what decision they were making.
We would have the freedom to trade with China and India and all the growing markets and be able to do so without the shackles of EU regulation.
Let's address this getting out into the world and trading, which is exactly what we're doing, by the way. We have 53 trade deals with other countries and territories because of the European Union. Just imagine again if we left. So you've got the effect by leaving of losing access to the single market hitting your economy. You also got what I would call the uncertainty effect. Greenland left the European Union. They mostly produce fish.
No,
hang on, no, that's my point. That is exactly my point. They mostly produce fish. There are 60,000 people. It took them 3 years to negotiate their exit, right? We'd have to negotiate our exit, negotiate our trading arrangements with the European Union, and negotiate 53 other trade agreements. In my view, this would take a decade. Do we want a decade of uncertainty? Do our businesses want a decade of uncertainty?
Have the same deals for 2 years. You would activate Article 50, it would take 2 years, we'd still be in the EU, we'd have some time to negotiate.
Okay, you activate Article 50.
You're going to activate that immediately?
That is what, if British people vote to leave, that's what we should do.
On the 28th of June, you will activate it at the European Council.
That's what we have to do. What would happen next? You have 2 years to negotiate. At the end of those 2 years, you are out, and you have to operate under World Trade Organization rules. And I want people to understand what that means. That means 10% tariffs on the cars that we sell to Europe. It means tariffs on the clothes we sell. It means potentially tariffs on the food that we sell. It would hammer our farmers. It would hammer jobs. It is, as the head of the World Trade Organization himself said, a disastrous outcome for Britain. And the reason why these economic arguments are so important is I think if we've learned anything over the last 6 years, if you don't have a strong economy, you can't have the health service that you want, you can't have the schools that you need, you can't have the public services you want. And this would be an act of economic self-harm of the United Kingdom doing it to ourselves.
We will still trade, and in your analyses, you have assumed the absolute worst possible scenarios.
No, I haven't.
And you know that many of these things, the Treasury Select Committee has said that you, the government, has misrepresented this £4,300 claim about families. Will you withdraw it?
I think you're wrong about that. The worst outcome is the one we were just discussing, where you go to World Trade Organization rules and you pay these tariffs.
Well, that's £6,000.
The one that we were putting in that document was the best trade deal that the European Union has done so far with another country, which was with Canada, right? It took 7 years to negotiate, and it still isn't complete. Now, Canada is 3,000 miles from the European Union. We are 20 miles from the European continent. We need a trade deal very badly, and we don't need a Canada trade deal. It doesn't cover... Yeah, but...
We'll inherit many of the same deals.
You're sounding a bit like the Brexit campaign, who just say, look, it's all going to be fine.
I need to put these questions to you, Prime Minister. But no, you have a number that your Treasury has claimed, that the Treasury Select Committee has said, and I'm going to quote this now, to persist with this claim would be to misrepresent the Treasury's own work. This is really important, because the way that you personally have framed the 4,300 claim means that many people on average household income of 45,000 think they're going to lose £4,000. They're not going to lose £4,000, are they? Can you clarify that?
What that figure is the loss to the economy divided by the number of households in our country. Look, if our country is poorer, then our households are going to be poorer. And what this means is fewer jobs. It means lower wages. It means less incomes. Those are the things that we'll be inflicting on ourselves if we were to vote to leave. Now, I've talked about the trade effect. That's because you're no longer part of the single market.
I want to get on with this economic...
I want to make one more point. We talked about the uncertainty effect. There's also, of course, the shock effect. Because people expect the country to be poorer by leaving, the shock of leaving, according to the Governor of the Bank of England, according to 9 out of 10 economists, is a severe shock that sees the pound fall, prices rise, and a recession in our economy.
Predicting a pound fall. I've never heard that. I've covered economics for 10, 15 years. Why are you comfortable with talking about sterling?
You can see it in the course of this campaign, when a good poll comes out for Brexit, the pound tends to fall.
Things go up or down. We can cope with movements in sterling. We're a strong nation. What are you saying?
Again, it all sounds so glib, just saying it's all going to be fine. If the pound falls, as economists forecast it would, that means the prices that we pay in our shops will be higher.
It's fallen this amount before, and we've stood up as a nation and coped with it.
But prices will be higher for people to pay in the weekly shop. That's what, that is the point. There's a shock effect. There's an uncertainty
Well, the shock effect is
a trade effect.
On the British public, on grannies. You were saying a vote to leave would threaten dignity in retirement. Even Jeremy Corbyn, who's on your side, is criticising myth-making and prophecies of doom.
But even if you don't want to believe the Treasury, you've got the 9 out of 10 economists, you've got the International Monetary Fund...
We know this.
You've got the Bank...
We've heard this
before.
before.
Saying we know this. It's a glib... Right. It'd be interesting if it was 1 or 2 organisations were worried about leaving, but the fact is every international organisation with any standing
let's move on.
all say the same thing about the economic effect.
Your scaremongering does not stop at the economy, does it? What comes first, World War III or the global Brexit recession?
read my speech. The words World War III never
a risk to
uttered by
peace
them.
and stability
Yes.
on our continent, serried rows of white headstones. How do you get from a vote to Brexit in 3 weeks' time to serried rows of white headstones?
Well,
can you explain the steps in
Yes,
between?
let me tell you exactly. Right, on our continent, in the last century, twice we had an enormous bloodbath between our nations. Europe's... Hang on, in the past. Again, can we be so confident that we've solved all of Europe's problems and all of Europe's tensions?
I can be confident we're not going to invade France and France is not going to invade us.
Again, you're being completely glib about it, right? Look, I sit round the European Council table. It can be immensely frustrating, but when you're there, you never forget that 70 years ago, these countries were fighting each other. I don't think we should take that for granted. Now, frankly, NATO has done the most to keep the peace in Europe, but the European Union has been a way of getting countries that used to fight each other to talk to each other.
Well, perhaps
and I don't think... No, but I think you are being incredibly glib about this. I think... Does Europe help to create dialogue in Europe?
You've made extraordinary claims.
Yes,
I'm
it
not
does.
being glib.
No, I
You've made
didn't. I never...
extraordinary claims. Perhaps you're the one that should be
you
fighting
read the
about
bit of
your
the speech.
disastrous party management.
Find me the bit of the speech that mentions World War III.
You said...
You won't find it. Come on.
You said serried rows of white headstones.
Well, there
Anyway,
are serried rows of
let's
white
move on.
headstones in
Let's
Europe
move-
because
Listen,
twice in a century Europe went to war, and on both occasions Britain had to go and be part of that conflict, and we paid a very, very heavy
listen,
price.
I've heard you this evening, and let me make a suggestion that you failed to hit that migration target. You failed to get a deal that would allow you to meet this migration target. You failed to, in your party management too. So you've reached for a classic Cameron fear campaign. It worked in the Scottish referendum, it worked in the general election campaign when you used the Scots to scare the English. And you're trying it again, but this time it's not working.
I just don't accept that, because it's not simply what I'm saying, right? You've got the Governor of the Bank of England, someone who came from Canada to do this very important job, who's impeccable independence, and has said he is very concerned about the economic consequences of Brexit. You've got the International Monetary Fund. Their job is to tell prime ministers about risks to their economy. You've got the Institute for Fiscal...
They often get that wrong.
Of course, yeah, no, of course. Look, individuals...
You are worried about losing, aren't you?
No, I'm delighted we're holding this referendum. It was a promise I made. It's a promise I'm proud to keep. I will carry out the instructions of the British people. But, frankly, I think the job of the Prime Minister is to warn about potential dangers, as well as to talk, as I hope we will when we do questions with the audience tonight, about the upsides and the opportunities that there are by being a member of this organisation. But if I didn't listen, frankly, to the IMF, to the OECD, to the Trade Union Congress, to the CBI, to the Governor of the Bank of England, if I didn't listen to any of these people, I would not be doing my job and I would not be serving this country that I'm so proud to lead.
More acronym. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you.